Beth has been doing political coverage on every stage from small to now national. Beth now is a national reporter, a political reporter for the National Journal. So now she's on pretty much the biggest stage here in Washington. And so she's going to talk a little bit about how it's done.
Thank you very
Thank you
much, Linda. Your very nice introduction makes me think of a conversation I had the other day with someone about interviewing, which I think is something we kind of forget is a skill and something that you can get better at. And it was actually a reminder to me because this person I was talking to was telling me that this person is now an editor and that he listens to reporters on the phone, and sometimes he hears how they kind of let people off the hook too easily. Because a lot of times when you're calling someone, it's uncomfortable. They maybe are being, either confrontational or making you feel silly for asking the question. And so, really what you just got to keep going and going until you get the answer that is there. A lot of times you know what you are trying to get from this person. And it's just a matter of the way this person said it, which was a good reminder to me, was just like, it's like endurance. Like you just got to keep this person on the phone until you get the answer that you want. Anyway, so Linda asked me to talk about writing about politics, and it's something I actually really like talking about because I think a lot of political writing is not done as well as it could be, and that there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about how opinionated, what is opinion, what is reporting, what is being fair and objective, and in this sort of mishmash environment where we live now, where everything is kind of viewed on the same level, the blogs, the newspapers, the cable channels, all gets kind of mashed together. The readers are just lost as to what is, opinion and what is not. And so it's just kind of up to us to decide on the standards for ourselves and the places where we work. I like to think that, there's sort of a spectrum between, over here is sort of the he said, she said reporting, where, say, you're covering a speech by a candidate and you're literally just a stenographer, writing down what that person says. And if you're doing that, you're not, in my opinion, doing the reader any favors, because they could be sort of watching that on C-SPAN and get the same thing. You're not bringing anything to the table. You're just basically standing there with a recording device, and on sort of the other side of the spectrum is an opinionated column. And, some of you may have jobs doing that or want to do that, which is fine. But sort of the way I see myself is someone who sort of tries to occupy some of that middle ground, which is that I'm not just reporting to you what was said, and I'm not giving you my opinion. But I am going to tell you kind of the way I see it, and that is based not on my personal preferences or ideology, but based on reporting. And so if I'm watching a political debate, I want to write a story that just tells you who won the debate. If someone won, I'm going to tell you who won. Now, I'm not going to tell you that person won because I like their ideas. I'm a Democrat, they're a Democrat. It can't be based on that, obviously. But I'm going to back that up. I'm going to back that up with how they carried themselves, what their voice did, the arguments that they made that were effective, that were persuasive, the weak, arguments that came from the other side. And, I actually feel like you're doing the reader a service by kind of telling that person what happened and trying to hide from what to be, the truth about the debate is silly. We don't need to do that, but we need to be able to back it up. So it is kind of that middle ground between the he said, she said, and the opinion. And I thought of a couple examples of stories I've done that kind of fit into what we're talking about, and then we can open it up for questions, because that is usually a better way to get to these things. So I was just kind of scrolling through stories, and because I was looking for a story that I wrote that had a lead that kind of sounded opinionated or sounded punchy. And I found one. So I wrote about the Virginia governor's race, and I wrote a story at one point in the campaign where my lead was Terry McAuliffe, that Democratic candidate. Terry McAuliffe is having an identity crisis. Okay, so flat on itself, like, that kind of sounds a little opiniony, and where is she going with that? So why do I feel like I have the authority to write that? Because I wrote a story basically about how he had promoted himself on his website as a businessman, completely stripping out his previous resume as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And yet, so he's trying to sell himself not as that, but as this, but yet there were all these questions being raised about businesses that he had run and their troubles and their track record. And so his whole conceit of like presenting himself as a businessman was kind of crumbling because, well, if you're a businessman, that's what you're showing us. And so I felt like that lead was totally justified based on the fact that I was, backing it up with the fact that he had removed the political part of his resume from his website. I looked at like an old, because he had run 4 years earlier, and I looked at his old one where he had talked about being DNC chair, and then it also backed it up with these questions about his two latest businesses. If you're going to run as a businessman, then we're going to look at this. So I feel like that's the kind of lead that I think a lot of editors are looking for, something punchy and clicky, but is not something that is cheap and opinionated. It's not a cheap shot, and it's not an overstatement. It's just, it's a little playful, but and this is politics. Like, I think we should have fun while we're covering it and enjoy ourselves as much as possible. But I thought it was fair, and I think the best thing that your sources can say to you, they may not agree with every story you like, but if they think that you backed it up, then there's only so much they can argue with. Okay, another example of how I kind of try to bring like sort of a foundation or substance to political reporting is a story I did pretty recently about the minimum wage. So Democrats are calling for an increase in the minimum wage right now. And a lot of the people who would be affected by the minimum wage are working class whites who in the past decades have completely shunned the Democratic Party. So the thinking among some Democratic strategists is that if Democrats push an increase in the minimum wage, maybe they can win some of these voters back, which seems plausible to me. So I thought, like the typical Washington story would be just to say, this is what the Democratic strategists think and blah, blah, blah. That would be fine. But I felt like if I could, I should try to talk to some folks who are earning the minimum wage. And what do they think of that? Would that make them more interested in voting for a Democrat? So I'll let you in on like my greatest secret as a reporter, which is when you need to interview real people, you go to a gas station. Because while gas people are filling up their cars, they are literally held captive. And like until recently, I used to go to Dunkin' Donuts, but people are like, I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry, and they have an excuse to pass you by. And I realized this time going to a gas station, it was so much better because they really were just standing there for a good 5 minutes. Anyway, so I went and I talked to some people, and this was in West Virginia, which does not like the Democratic Party, does not like Obama. And it was interesting because even though obviously someone who's making minimum wage would like to earn more money, it was clear to me by talking to some of those folks that it's not like this is going to be the magic formula for the Democratic Party to recapture these voters. There's a lot of suspicion and distrust between some of the folks that I was talking to and the way they view the party, and those are challenges that are deep and profound and are going to maybe take years and years to overcome. So I felt like it could have, it would have been an okay story, just writing about like strategists say this is, the way to this voting bloc's heart. But by sort of going a little bit deeper, going the extra mile and talking to some voters, it just added a little bit more to it. And not that this is like a great story by any stretch of the imagination, but just a little bit better than what it could have been. And I always, like, if there's an opportunity to talk to people, I will usually try to do it, because I find that, you know, especially in Washington, you can kind of, that gets lost. And so, like, if I'm writing about abortion, I'm going to try to go to an abortion clinic, or I'm going to try to talk to someone who's had an abortion. Like, it's not that the time is always not there, the opportunity is not always there, but if it's there as a political reporter, I think it's always good to try and make that happen. Okay, another example of a story that I thought was a smart way to approach it. Okay, during the presidential campaign, I don't know if y'all remember, the Washington Post broke this big story about how when Mitt Romney was in high school, I think, he and some other kids had bullied this kid they thought was gay and cut his hair. It was very shocking. Okay, so, you know, you're sitting at your desk and, like, the Washington Post has broken this big story, and, like, well, what do you do? Like, you know, and you know, a lot of political reporters, you know, will just, like, their editors will be on them, you got to come up with something, and so they, you know, riff something off the Washington Post story. And that was basically kind of what my editor was asking me to do. It's like, we need something, you know, we need something off this. And so I was like, okay, what do I do? Like, you know, sort of the obvious avenues that did not seem very interesting to me were, you know, we can, like, speculate about, like, how voters are going to react to this. And, you know, it just becomes one of those stories that doesn't have very much lasting power. So the idea I came up with, which I was really pleased with, and again, this is not by any means a blockbuster story, but I just, like, elevated it from kind of the, you know, D- to, like, the C+ B- level, was I said, you know, I wonder what Romney's record was as governor of Massachusetts when it came to, like, these, you know, anti-bullying laws that have become, you know, very much in you know, vogue the last few years. And, you know, I called some gay rights groups, I guess, in Massachusetts, and I found that when he had been first elected, he had, like, signed gay pride proclamations. But, you know, the closer he got to declaring his run for president, he had kind of moved away from being all about, you know, tolerance and love and understanding. So it was a story about, like, basically his record on this issue. And so that story stands. Like, that story is as true today as it was that day. Whereas the story about whether voters would care about it or not, that's a story that, like, literally lasts 5 minutes, you know? And we've all done those stories, and I'm probably going to do one today. But you know what I mean? Like, it's good to try to, like, think, okay, what is a story that's going to last? And if you can go back to the person's record, you know, that's always going to provide you with something that is a little more lasting, and in this case was a little bit enlightening. So there's another good example. The only other thing I wanted to mention was, just because we were talking about this at lunch, is if you are someone who kind of wants to be seen as a reporter and not as a opinion maker or pundit, you know, I think you, in this day and age, have to be really careful about the emails that you send and the things that you post on Twitter. And I have a real problem with people who are, like, snarky and opinionated and, you know, at the, you know, trying to kind of boost their Twitter following and probably being very successful at it by saying outrageous things, you know, and I think it reduces your credibility as a reporter. And I mean, the way I look at it is that, like, if I'm covering a campaign, like if I'm covering, say, the presidential campaign, like, I need to be able to go back to those people the next day after writing, you know, maybe a negative story. So it's just not worth it to, like, post some snarky remark on Twitter about a candidate that is going to, in their eyes, kind of reduce your credibility. And I just think the temptation is so great. It's so easy. We all have funny things to say. And on the email thing, I just thought I'd mention that also because, you know, I increasingly am communicating with people by email. And you have to remember that anything you put in the email is something that if they don't like your story, at the end of the day, they're going to like post online or show your editor. And so you want to be really careful in your emails with sources, not to be too cute or snarky or playful or anything. Like you want to try to keep it as, I mean, with people you're friendly with, you can be friendly, but you know, just always remember that everything that you write is something that can live another day and come back to haunt you. So just like a word of caution. But anyway, if open it up to questions and anything you want to ask about. Yeah.
Going back to your interviewing prowess, I wonder if you have any tips about sort of how to cut through talking points and get to substantive answers.
Yeah.
Especially when you're just catching somebody on the fly, like in the Capitol or.
I hate those interviews. So hard. I mean, there's a few things I hate about those interviews. One is that it's so hard to like come back, because they'll literally have 2 seconds. And also I hate it because there's always a lot of other people around. But frequently that's your only opportunity to get that legislator. So I don't know that there is like a secret answer, except that, I will try to come up with my question, beforehand, like really think it out. Like, okay, if I ask it this way, then he'll just say no and walk away. But if I ask it this way, it kind of forces them to answer. It's like, I actually got to participate in one of the presidential primary debates, and we would sit around and play with the questions and think about how to ask them in such a way that the candidate would actually have to answer the question, which somehow, of course, they almost always figured out a way not to, but we did give it our best shot. So I just think if you have time to like plan a little bit about how you're going to formulate the question so that they can't just give a quick yes or no answer, and then kind of be prepared if you can for a follow-up. Obviously if you're on the phone or sitting down with someone, that's a lot easier. And I think it's just a matter of, being polite, but also being sort of as firm and aggressive as you can. I mean, one little thing I like to say is that sort of, it's like almost giving like someone a friendly warning, like I'm going to challenge you. I say, I'm going to push back on that if you don't mind. And then I'll say, da 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 da. So, or, you can say, well, I think that, your opponents would say this. How would you respond to that criticism? Is another way to go about it. And so, and kind of like what I said when I first started talking is just really just keeping that person on the phone. Being able to sort of sit there in silence for a minute if they don't answer the question right away. Another thing that for some reason works really well, more than I expect, is at the end of an interview, I will almost always say, is there anything I haven't asked you, something that you want to add? And like usually that's like the perfect quote right at the end. And I'm like, oh, thank God, like they just finally have figured out what they want to say, and can string a sentence together. So that's something I usually throw in there that helps.
So if you are interviewing someone, whether it be a politician or not a politician, and they come right out and say, okay, but I'm not going to talk about that on the record, and then just continue on saying what you want them to say, how do you like get them to then say it again to you on their, or change their mind, or do you
Okay.
not? That's the bigger thing.
Yeah, and that's really tricky in Washington too, because I learned this. I just started working in Washington 3 years ago, and I learned very quickly that everyone in Washington thinks it's okay for everything to be off the record, and that we're all cool with that. And like, we all have to join together right now and make a pact in this room that we are going to 99% of the time make people talk to us on the record, because if we don't do it, we make it harder for everyone else out there. Everyone else out there who's letting everyone talk off the record is making it harder for me. And it really pisses me off. And we're not doing any of us a favor. So, I mean, a couple things. I mean, again, in those hallway conversations, it can be really difficult. But first of all, you want to say, wait a minute, I'm not ready to agree. I haven't agreed to that yet. I mean, nothing is off the record until you have agreed to that as well. I mean, the other thing is that making the distinction between off the record and on background. Now, some people think one is one is the other. I don't think it really matters. I think you just have to know what your definition is and that your source knows the definition. To me, off the record means I cannot use this at all. On background means I can use this, I just can't attribute it to you. So if you tell me, Mitt Romney's first campaign appearance is going to be in Boston. I can write that, but I can't say, said blah, 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 blah. So you want to just be able to have the terms. And again, there's a way to do that in a way that's both firm and friendly. Like, I don't want to burn you. I want us to have a good relationship. I know how people feel when they feel like they've been, quoted. They said something off the record and then they see it quoted. So I just want to make sure we have, the terms straight. And so you're protecting yourself, and I think hopefully giving that person maybe a little bit of confidence and comfort. And I think it's really a tough call. A lot of times with someone squirmy, like the only way they're going to talk to you is, at least at first, on background. And what I will say with someone who's reluctant like that, I will say, why don't we start talking on background, and then at the end of the conversation, if there are things that you said that I'd like to put on the record, I would like to sort of reserve the right to go back to, statements that you said earlier. And what is so funny to me is people are just like, so frequently they're like, oh, I'm only going to talk to you on background. And then you go back to them and go, well, can I use that quote on the record? Yeah. Can I use that quote on the record? Yeah. Like, they're just like, it's like reflexive. It's like the minute they get on the phone, they know you're a reporter. We're on background. Like, it's just like becomes so just part of the way they do business. And so you can challenge that, and then if they're like not going to talk to you, I kind of use that as my default, which is, I'm going to need something on the record. So if we talk on background and then go back, and usually people are pretty amenable to that. The only thing that you can kind of get yourself in trouble in a little bit is if they say something and they say, well, can we, they try to sort of like play a game with you. Well, can we say it this way or can we say it that way? And it becomes sort of a negotiation. That's not obviously an ideal situation to be in, but you just have to kind of weigh the importance of the information versus the sort of lowering the standard that you're doing. One thing I see so much of in Washington is people using anonymous quotes gratuitously for basically political hacks. I mean, I think you protect people who are risking their life and livelihood by, telling you that the nuclear power plant is leaking. But I'm not going to protect, some political hack who wants to say something snarky about another politician and just doesn't want that politician to know it. That's just, bullshit. And I frequently find that covering politics, the lower you go, the more people are willing to be critical on the record. For example, you're not going to find someone in the White House who's going to criticize the president, right? And you may not even find a Democrat in Congress who's going to criticize the president. But kind of the lower down the food chain you go, you will always find someone, whether it's someone in a state party or a local party or literally an on-the-ground activist or a member of Congress as opposed to a senator. There's always a way. It requires maybe 3 extra phone calls. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of that time. But I just think it gives your story so much more credibility when you have names next to every quote as much as you can. And I know that it's not possible sometimes, but.
How much effort do you put into the day after when that flack calls you and took your story very personally?
Yeah.
And wants to fight you line for line?
Right. Again, as best you can, keep your cool. And I know I've made that mistake. I kind of get really defensive and emotional, especially sometimes someone calls you and they go, oh, I want a correction. And you're just like, yeah, right. And it's nothing they want is anything in the realm of factual type corrections. It's all this, basically disagreements over a story. But the other thing I've been doing actually lately, when I've done this I think 3 times lately, someone's called to complain about a story. I hear them out. I listen to what they say. They kind of get the steam off their chest. And then I say, why don't we meet for coffee next week? Or can I buy you a drink next week? And then that person becomes someone who you haven't necessarily burned a bridge with, someone who now then gets to know you a little bit, sees that you're not a serial killer or mean, and you have a cup of coffee, you have a beer with them, and then usually you can now call that person again, as opposed to if you hadn't had that personal interaction, you've kind of burned a bridge. And, sometimes you got to burn your bridges. But I find that usually when I ask people for coffee or lunch, they will not say no, even if they're mad at you. And if there's someone that you're going to need, it's worth it. So.
Do you do any reporting, whether it be source hunting or anything using Twitter or other social media?
I don't.
What you thought about it.
I know. I think I've been definitely been tempted, and I may have maybe once or twice on Twitter. I see reporters doing it a lot. Anyone out there who falls into this category, you're looking for some kind of person, like anyone who's losing their unemployment benefits, or so the reason I'm reluctant to do that sometimes is, one, I don't like to telegraph to everyone in the world what I'm working on, is the main reason. I'm not on Facebook. I could see how that would be useful for that sometimes. There's almost always a way around it. There's almost always like someone you could call that's going to lead you to the type of person that you want. But I'm sure there are people who do it very successfully. I just I am not one of them. I can't think of an example where I've succeeded at it.
I have a question, like
Yeah.
a sub-question.
Yeah.
So do you ever use it for story idea finding?
Again, I'm sort of like, I'm very old school in that I'm private about what I'm working on. And I'm actually, this is like heresy, but I'm just not that interested in what other people think about,
Well, for example, because I use it often, and I was doing something, I forget what it was. It wasn't, once there was a storm that was coming up, and it was like taking the same path as Katrina. And everyone was like, oh no, it was
Okay.
Hurricane Irene.
Okay.
And I was looking for people that didn't have like power, so I tweeted that out, and in response I got a bunch of people who were like having some other completely unrelated problem, and realized that this was, I don't know if it was like, maybe we weren't looking for someone without power, we were looking for someone whose like house was flooded, and then we found out that there was another problem through it. So it wasn't really what like other reporters were tweeting that they were working on, it was more
Right.
like that, but I guess you answered
I
my
think you can do it. I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I just personally am a little squeamish about it, and have usually figured out a way around it.
I was just curious. You're obviously a political writer, so that's your first priority. But how do you juggle the, like, for instance, the minimum wage story? There's a political element to that, which it may get them votes, or it may, in fact, be a false hope that therefore that's just as good of a story. But it's also the reality of, like, for people who don't make very much, it's going to be a meaningful, potentially economic, change for them. So your job is not to write about economic policies, so to speak, but about the political angle. But how do you? It seems like so much what comes out of Washington is the politicization of actually real things that affect people.
That's a good point. I mean, one thing I noticed during the last campaign is every time the unemployment number came out, it was like it was the story. This is good for Obama, or this is bad for Obama. And you rarely saw a story that was like, who this really sucks for?
Right.
The guy who
Right.
can't get a job.
Right.
So I think if you can do both, then that's the best. That's the best we can hope for. If you can get that real person in there, and so it becomes more than just a horse race story. But also, we're covering a horse race. It is a horse race. It is either good for Obama or bad for Obama, depending. So that would be the ultimate. But I think in a lot of cases, we can do better than just the horse race.
Well, a follow up to that, like, is there a risk though to assume that every time a Democratic president were to put forward an idea that they are actually hoping that they'll get these votes, or maybe there's people that for like 20 years have been arguing that we need to raise the, it's bad policy to have such low wages and we should change that for the good of people. And how do you decide if you're I don't mean to be naive, because obviously there's a political angle and all of that. But.
Right. I don't know that you have to decide whether someone is doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. because I don't think we can ever like kind of know what really is in someone's heart. I mean, does President Obama really want immigration reform, or does he just want a wedge issue to beat up Republicans with? I mean, I don't know the answer. I mean, I think probably in most cases it's a little of both. Like, people have sort of a ideology that, this direction, but oh, by the way, it's going to help them with this constituency. So I think if we lay that out, also looking at a person's record, like, is there anything in the record that kind of contradicts or backs up the position that they're taking today?
A good example, I covered gay marriage for Tom for a bunch of years, and suddenly Obama went from being like a laggard on gay marriage to being like, and the first instinct, I think rightfully, was like, this is politics. But then he went so far and followed it up in the State of the Union that it became tremendously substantive. So it's like, whatever his background was, it's a substantive story.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, and I think I'm sure your coverage reflected that. Sort of. One of the good things, I guess, about the internet is that you can get sort of that second shot at a story. Like, maybe you're on deadline and your editor says, okay, I want a story about the unemployment rate and what that means for the president, like, in a half hour. And so you crank out something perfunctory, and then you take 2 hours and you go out to a gas station, you find someone who's unemployed, and you come back and you add that, and now you've elevated your story. And if you're writing for print, maybe the better story goes into your print product. So I think in the ideal world that's what we can all strive for.
thank you.
What's your best advice for finding sort of, diverse conservative voices that are relevant, that are not just sort of Fox News sort of talking heads, but just sort of like substantive, diverse meaning non-white sort of political voices?
Yeah, I mean, I try to be conscious of that. I mean, I will look at my list of sources and I see how the preponderance are men, preponderance are white, especially Republicans. I have like very few Republican women on my list. And yeah, so it's like when you find someone, and I actually just had this experience, like I went to lunch with a couple Republican female strategists, and I was like, thank God, because I'm always quoting so-and-so and so-and-so, and you start to feel silly after a while. I just think it's kind of like getting out there and meeting people, like, maybe you go to, CPAC, that conference, and you go to where the booths are, and or you're poking around the blogosphere. Sometimes you could play those games on Twitter where let's say you're looking for conservatives, right? So you might go to someone, a well-known conservative, and see the people that are following him and see which of those have big Twitter followings that show some legitimacy there. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes Twitter will suggest people. There's you can kind of do it from noodling around sometimes. Or like I said, just kind of in the course of I think if you're conscious of it, that, it will come. I think, I appreciate that you're trying to do that, because I do that too. And I think that it's really easy just to quote the same people over and over. And I'd be probably embarrassed to see how many of my stories I don't have any women quoted or all white people quoted. So I think that is like a little part of our responsibility.
Can you talk a little bit about the issue of false balance and how you approach that in your reporting?
Tell me what you mean by that.
So as opposed to, this site says this site says this in the story, and just presenting that as it is, it's not always that simple. It's never that simple. How do you kind of guide your readers?
And sometimes one side is just totally wrong.
Yeah.
And you know that, so.
Right.
How do you approach that as a journalist? It's kind of going back to your first point.
Yeah. I had an interesting experience recently where I was writing something about a campaign, and then I can't remember what it was, but it was something that, slightly negative about this candidate or this campaign. And then I did quoted the candidate or the campaign defending themselves. And my editor wanted to take that out. And she said, "You're undermining your arguments." And I said to her, "I don't really care if I'm undermining my argument. Like, I'm not going to write this story without at least the perfunctory quote." But in this case, that perfunctory quote I thought was legitimate. Like, I thought, okay, like, that wasn't complete bullshit. Like, I know what you're talking about, the denials, which you know are not true. And I think, you know, as much as possible, we should not, like, just put that in as filler just because we think we're supposed to. But I think a lot of times, especially in politics, like, things are just not clear cut, like, almost never, right? And so I think, you know, you want to sort of, I think you want to be fair and fair to both your reader and to your sources. And if they can make a decent, you know, give you a decent caveat, you know, I definitely err on the side of wanting to put it in. But I also will, another thing you can do is, like, if someone's response to you think is really lame or silly, like, you can challenge them and say, well, wouldn't it be a better, you know, like, try to get them to maybe refine their argument. You know, but again, like, that pushing back, that staying on the phone with somebody, you know, maybe you can, you know, they can, you know, you see something that they may not see. And then the story ends up being more revealing for that. Sure. Yeah.
Just wondering if you had advice for us now that it's 2014, and I'm sure many of us are going to be covering congressional and Senate campaigns.
Yeah.
Like, how you go into a campaign and how you sort of best advice to sort of frame the arguments, so you're not just doing like a he said, she said sort of piece between the candidates.
Oh goodness. Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. You know, it's always fun when you're writing about a congressional district, which is smaller. You can get your arms around it. Is to actually, like, do some research on the district. You know, how have the demographics changed since the last election? You know, did Obama win it? Did Romney win it? What is the history of it? What's the voting history there? Who makes up the local county commission, or who represents it? You know what I'm saying? Like, almost like a political profile of the district, even before you get to the candidates. You know, what's the main source of employment? So that then that kind of informs you a little bit as to what questions you want to ask. You know, what are the big priorities? Is it a coastal district that cares about flood insurance or not? You know, always a good kind of way to get started is you know, looking at the campaign finance reports. You know, where are these people getting their money from? You know, if the campaign is underway. You know, I kind of think sometimes it's always, you can get more out of people going lower and lower and lower. So, like, you may not get something out of a senator, but you may get something out of a state rep or a mayor or a county commissioner that might be really helpful in learning about the district or about those candidates. And go there if you can, you know, as much as possible.
Who are the writers, like the writing, that you most appreciate or were influences long ago?
Oh, wow. You know who I really like these days is this guy, Beth Reinhard, who writes for the Washington Post. He wrote a lead the other day that just killed me about Steve Stockman, this Tea Party guy who's running against John Cornyn for the Senate. And he wrote something like, Steve Stockman is the closest thing running to a middle finger this election cycle. That was just awesome, right?
I just read about Stockman. I wish I'd read that.
I know, I felt the same way.
That's great.
You know, it's so hard because there's so much out there. Like, I really have a hard time kind of reading as much as I would like to. You know, at the Post, I think the Post has a lot of good political writers. I read the Post and the New York Times every day. And beyond that, I'm getting doing most of my reading on Twitter. So like I just kind of pick the political journalists I think are good and follow them on Twitter. I don't do as much, I use Twitter much more for that than I do for like following, say, politicians or consultants, because I think a lot of what they say is usually pretty predictable. So I use Twitter more as like my news feed. So I like Real Clear Politics. They usually have an interesting mix of people they post on there. I mean, it's funny, in the beginning of my career, I wanted to be a columnist. I wanted to be Anna Quinlan. And that was 20 some years ago. And now, like, opinions have become so cheap on the internet that I find that I'm much more impressed by people who are doing more reporting, following the money. I just think we need more of that. And the opinion stuff, which used to be like only done by very special people, now, as you know, is just so routine. So I'm not as impressed with that as I used to be, but so.
Interesting.
Anyone else?
Beth, you talked at the beginning about the fact that people who consume news now are confused by all the opinion that's out there, by the blogs. They don't know who to believe. It's hard to tell fact from opinion. Is there anything you can suggest that people in this group can do or that NPF can do? Because this is something obviously our board has thought a lot about. And one of the members of our board is Tom Rosensteel, who's a rather famous writer on journalism. To fix that, how do we fix it? And maybe this is something I'll pose the question to you, but certainly open to ideas from the rest of the group. We know we have a situation where people have lost their faith in, quote, the media, and people who aren't part of the media lump all of us together. Everybody from Ezra Klein to Drudge to
Yeah.
pajamas in his basement, whoever that is.
Yeah.
So how do we fix it? What do we do?
I don't know if this is a fix, but I mean, I think one way I hold myself accountable is that I send every story I write, pretty much, I send to all the people I quoted in the story, and I say thank you for your time. And so after it's published, the next day. So why am I doing that? One, to get the story out. Two, I'm continuing to build the relationship with that person, whether I've known them for a long time or this is the first time I've talked to them. Like, that follow-up email is just like, I'm for real. And it's also an opportunity for them to email you back and say, I really didn't like the way you said this, or I really like the way you said this. And I think that's how you build a little bit of the trust. I don't know that that's a solution, but I think you can only just do what we are all doing, is trying to be straight and truthful with people and try to be accurate as much as possible, even under the deadlines that we're all under. To push back sometimes when we have to, and we're not ready to post something because we haven't fact checked it. The mantra that my husband uses, who is also a journalist, when he reads through a story, he asks himself after every sentence, how do I know that to be true? How do I know that to be true? How do I know that to be true? So you kind of, even if it's a date or a number you think in your head 100 times, like, go back to that primary source, and so, just kind of the old-fashioned stuff of trying not to have any mistakes. Now, we're all going to have some once in a while, but if we can minimize it, I think that helps.
Let me ask a question here. Figure out how to phrase this. If you in this room publish more than half of your words without being edited, raise your hand. Just one.
Oh wait, without like
No one reads it.
Without having another person
Read it.
look at them.
Okay, no.
No,
Yeah.
you don't.
That's comforting to me. That is a really scary trend.
How many people publish some part of what they do without another person reading it?
Yeah.
1, 2,
I
3,
mean,
4, 5.
sometimes it's
5,
backward,
5 or 6.
you know, once
What's
it's
that?
up. Sometimes like a blog,
Right.
somebody else will typically read it, but probably not for an hour.
Yeah.
A few hours later, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, the 6th
I,
paragraph.
I can't imagine it working. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 hours later.
I get that. You know, did you really mean Bill? What about law?
Ugh.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many people saw the little kerfuffle a couple days ago about the person whose editor said, find some people whose insurance got way more expensive under Obamacare? And, you know, the reporter had like an hour, and so they called somebody at the Tea Party who gave them a couple of names and called those people and wrote a story, and it turned out to be like totally not true because the people they spoke to, many of them hadn't even tried to get coverage.
yeah.
They hadn't even gone to the
Okay.
website.
Well,
They
the
just-
mistake was going to the Tea Party.
Well, right.
I mean, you go to some like group that helps low income people. You know, you don't go to the Tea Party. Like, I think you've invited trouble.
If you go to them, you could have asked the right questions. I mean, they should have asked them, like, did you try?
You may not have time though to like, you know, show me the documentation. Like, yeah.
And in this case, the person's, I mean, it was obvious looking at the story because they had, you know, quotes from people who said, my policy was canceled and the insurance company told me it was gonna cost me $1,500 a month or something, and, you know, which is just a completely out of the realm kind of number based on what we know about the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
But even the person's editor didn't know enough about the Affordable Care Act to be able to
Yeah, I mean, I think that can happen to the best of us, but you know, and when you're under pressure, like I could see going to like a partisan source when you were really in the crunch. But I think maybe you say to yourself, okay, I have very little time, so I know I'm going to a partisan source, so I had better be extra careful. Like I better like really vet this person in the 20 minutes I spend interviewing them, if that's my only option. I mean, you know, just in answer to your other question about like credibility, I mean, I think what I was saying earlier about, you know, the way you present yourself on Twitter, the way you present yourself in your emails to your sources, you know, the way whether you accept a drink or food when you're at an event. I mean, I think just the rules have just gotten so loose in Washington on that. And I think, you know, I think people respect reporters that are cautious about that kind of stuff.
Are the rules different in Washington than in Tallahassee in terms of relationships with members or other sources?
I mean, a little bit, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of blurred lines here between the socializing and what I would call schmoozing for work purposes. And, you know, friends, I'm not friends with any of my sources, not a single one. None of them are coming to my kid's birthday party. It's one of the reasons I'm not on Facebook, because I do not want, like, I went on Facebook and all of a sudden I found like my girlfriends like asking me questions, posting photos, and then my sources that I had allowed to, it was just like this terrible merger of worlds that I want to keep separate. And like I'm super chatty and friendly with my sources, but I'm not friends with them. And if I'm going out to dinner with them, it's to get a story. Like I don't want them to have any illusions about that. And I think in Washington, for people who've been here a long time, that it does become it comes into the friend area. And then you're compromised. You're not going to write a tough story about that person, even if it falls into your lap, or it's going to get very uncomfortable. So if I felt like I had a relationship with someone where I couldn't write a tough story about them, I mean, that would be like a warning light to me that that I should either this person is my friend or this person is my source.
Anybody else have any experience with that in Washington? Good or bad, one way or the other? Anybody friends with sources?
I mean, I've had people say to me, well, you know, we're friends, and so blah, blah, and then I always will be like, no, we're not. And I've had people get really offended, you know, and they're like, what? And I'm like, look, I like you. You're funny. I love talking on the phone. You give me great ideas, but like never mistake me for that, you know?
Kind of a story on that. A friend that I had before I started covering oil and gas issues, her dad is a senior oil and gas executive who's been a really valuable anonymous source for me for a lot of these stories, especially out of the Middle East and some stuff where not a lot of people can add perspective. But it is weird because she's definitely my friend, but it's also not her exactly, so it's a little different. I feel like, right, it's one step removed, but at the same time I do kind of think about that, like, what if his company came up and like,
right,
you know, in some of these stories, like how would I treat that?
Right.
You know.
Oh, cross that bridge.
Right. But it's an interesting thing. You know, at this point, it was like, okay, I'll take it. You know, it's a good source to have. But like, does raise some interesting questions as to how, you know, if something newsworthy happened regarding that company, how I would approach it would be, I think, an open question.
Head on.
Yeah, I would, no holds barred.
I have a question. Do you go to, speaking of the culture of Washington, do you go to the White House Correspondence dinner? Okay. And also, what do you think of the column that ran in the Politico magazine by Sam Youngman about some of the culture?
Yeah.
God. Okay, I did go to the White House Correspondence Dinner because my husband won an award. So I went as like the date. So that was awesome. And I got to like shake the president's hand and gawk at Claire Danes, and that was great. And I was like, thought it was awesome to be there. And I got to go to the White House Christmas party one time, and I thought that was totally awesome too. I do get, you know, a lot of people do these. Yeah, no. I do get a lot of invitations to, you know, like lobbying offices, and law offices will have receptions. And I always kind of think it'd probably be good to go and schmooze, but like, I don't know about you guys. I would just almost always rather go home. So I don't know. I think it's important to get out after work with sources and have lunch and be in those kind of more relaxed environments. But I just think that you don't want to be doing too much of that either. I don't know, it's a tough call. That story was hard to read.
What story?
The Sam Youngman story was hard to read. So this is a guy who worked in Washington for a long time, kind of sold his soul, you know, wrote a lot of trashy stories, drank too much, and now has redeemed himself by going home to Kentucky and getting back to real reporting. And so, I mean, in one sense, I appreciate and agree with part of the story, which is like, I, as someone who used to cover Florida politics, like loved doing that and think that it can be a lot more rewarding than what I do here. I think it's much harder to be a good national political reporter than it is to, like, you know, be in charge of a county or a state and wrap your arms around it and own it. Like, I love doing that, and I think really good stories come from that. And frequently a lot of mediocre stories come out of Washington, right? And it's just harder. Like, it's just a bigger playground. So I appreciated that, but I also am not part of the Washington that he described, and I like to think that probably none of you guys are either. I mean, everyone likes to sort of joke and broad brush Washington. We're all a bunch of hacks and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, not all of us are. And this is where we make our living and live and raise our children. And so I don't, you know, I have dignity doing that. And, like, I think the sort of suggestion was that, like, you know, the only, like, real truth can be found back home, which I don't think is true. I just think it's harder.
Yeah, I mean, I knew Sam before. What I thought of him was he only looked at a very narrow slice of the Washington press corps.
Yeah.
And then he, like, romanticized Kentucky, but if he had learned so much, where was the wisdom that he had learned about politics? You know, he's just been there for 3 months, so.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. I'm not part of that Washington, but I struggle with that because opportunities will come up to go to a party, and it's that whole like, oh, I probably should go and schmooze, but I don't know. I just think it's like you make it kind of those calls on a case by case basis of whether you think you're going to get something out of it, whether you're going to feel yucky being there. I've definitely been in situations where I'm just like, I don't feel good about the scene, and it's not really, it's just doesn't feel professional, and you got to get yourself out of there. So I think it's easy to get into those situations in Washington, definitely. So
You mentioned earlier covering the horse race.
yeah,
You're a political writer, so the horse race is part of that.
yeah.
How big a part is it, and is it too big a part? The way it's, we hear obviously a lot of criticism. Oh,
Right.
just covering the horse race. Nothing really matters. How do you respond to that? Why is it important?
Why is it important?
Especially early on, when only Washington is paying attention. Or maybe that isn't true. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. I like the horse race. I don't pretend to be someone who doesn't write about the horse race. And, but I also don't, I like to think that my stories are not shallow. So I'm trying to, as you're asking this question, I'm trying to think what makes a story about who's winning or losing worthwhile or interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that you could do that. You could accomplish that in your coverage while still kind of writing about whether they're winning or losing.
So how many of you in this room will have to cover a congressional race this year? Okay, about half.
I mean, it's the why, right? It's not just the who's winning or losing, but why are they winning or losing? So if you're a good reporter and you talk to 3 or 4 people and you find, you've got some interesting reporting behind it, I think then you've got yourself a story. If it's a story that's just like, this poll, this automated poll by a partisan polling firm says so-and-so is winning, and that's the totality of your story, then that's a waste of your time. But if you go beyond that, then I think I think polls are really helpful. I just don't like writing a story just about a poll. I think it's great to use polls as if you talk to 4 people, they're one of the 4 people that you've talked to. It's just another layer of reporting. And I think we want to be careful about, knowing a little bit about where the poll's coming from, whether it's a partisan source, whether it's automated, whether they're credible. You want to spend 5 minutes checking them out. Because there's definitely
websites that help you with good websites whose polls you trust.
Yeah. You guys we'll probably all go to the same websites. I go to Real Clear Politics or what is it, Polling Report or something. But there's actually a guy in our office who covers polling, and I'll email him. So I have kind of an easy shortcut there, and he'll be like, oh, that's automated, oh, that's partisan. But, usually by Googling it, you can kind of see, oh, this poll's been quoted in a lot of newspapers, or, or you can kind of, see that it's nobody's heard of this place, or it's a partisan operation. And I'm not saying you shouldn't necessarily even use a partisan poll, but I think we just always have to make sure to identify it as partisan. As a Democratic firm or Republican firm. Because sometimes those polls are good, but we just have to kind of protect ourselves that way. So.
I have another question, Blake?
I was just thinking something you mentioned earlier when you're calling up sources and you have an idea of a quote that you want from them. ethically, when you're looking for story ideas, when you're pursuing a story, how do you balance what comes up naturally in the conversation that could be newsworthy versus what you expect from a story and what you want that story to include as a, just as a
Yeah.
person,
You know, okay, let me clarify that. I guess, sure, there are definitely times when you want a quote.
Do it too, like that.
Right, like dial a quote kind of thing. But also, but I guess what I really mean is like when you call someone, I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay, I did a story recently where I was calling sort of establishment Republicans and talking to them about how worried they were about some of the Tea Party candidates that are running for Congress. And so what I knew is that I know they are worried. But I knew that they would act like they're not worried, right? So again, that was kind of a stay on the phone kind of thing. And so I knew they were going to give me the talking points about, you know, the Tea Party's fizzling out and blah, blah, blah. And this is why, you know, things are looking up for the Republican Party and all this. But like, I just kept, you know, until I got kind of the quote I was looking for, which is a little different than the dialect quote. It's kind of like, you know this to be true.
Right. So
You
that's
kind of
about-
know that this person, it feels this way. But yeah, I agree. You've got to allow for the element of you being wrong and the element of surprise. I mean, all of us have had the experience where an editor has a premise for a story and the reporting just does not back it up and you're just like totally screwed. And you have to go to your editor and say like, actually the story is this. So it's always the editor's fault. Always. But yeah, I mean that happens more often than I would like. So yeah, we have to be able to adjust on deadline to those unfortunate circumstances when we are wrong.
I was wondering, when you call sources, do you always have a clear story idea in mind, or sometimes do you call people just kind of fishing for what's going on?
Fishing is like, I wish I spent way more time fishing because I find that, and I'm sure you guys all of this, like you're so busy working on the story in front of you that you never have time to call your sources. The only time you call the source is when you need a quote from them. And that is usually not ideal. Like, it's great to be able to call someone, hey, I'm trolling for stories. I am totally open about that. Usually people are flattered and they want to pitch an idea. And, you know, sometimes the story is not really like the way they've put it, but it gives you something. I do that with email a lot. Like on a Sunday night, when I'm like starting to panic that I have nothing to write about this week, I'll send out a bunch of emails Sunday night. Hey, what should I be writing about this week? You know, 2 out of the 10 people will take the time to respond, and one of them will be a good story. So I do that a lot. I think it's really hard to come up with good enterprise stories in Washington. I struggle with it so much. I'm like constantly in a state of panic that I don't know what my next story is about. So, yeah, so I do that a lot. Yeah. Yeah, no, every Sunday night I go into like total panic mode. And then like, you know, I feel so good once I have a story in mind, and then that story's over, and then it's like, oh my God, now what? You know, so, yeah, in fact, I don't know if I have it now, but I used to have like, you know, little Post-it reminders on my, you know, reminding me to call people. And at like, you know, at certain point, I've had editors tell me like, you know, you should try to call this many sources every day or this many a week. I mean, a lot of times, like, you know, when you're on deadline and you have to go into that little like bunker, you can't look at Twitter, you can't look at email, you can't call sources, you just have to get your story done, right? But it's good to like try to get at least a couple of those calls as much as you can every day, if possible.
Do you have suggestions for developing relationships or schmoozing over with staff members, especially congressional staff, and who are the best people to go after? I mean, obviously we deal with the flacks and spokespeople, but, you know, how do you get to the kind of the committee level staff or that are probably know the most and are most likely to tell you the juicy things on that?
Right.
About the story?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't have a lot of sources on, like, because I haven't covered Congress like that. But what I would do is I don't know that it's different than anything else. Like, I would go to the committee hearing and I'd stay after, and I'd walk up to them and introduce themselves. I'd follow them back, walk with them down the hall back to their office. I mean, the Capitol, the halls are just like, that is where you can do a lot of really good reporting.
It seems like here, I mean, things are so closed off. Only certain people are authorized to talk to you, and then some of the other people don't.
Right.
Kind of don't want to talk to you at all because they're scared that you're going to quote them or.
Right. If you can like get into the office, I think is like, and just like sit your butt down in a chair. Hey, can I, could you introduce me to some of the folks in your office? Just be really friendly and push it as much as you can, I think. If you talk to someone on the phone, hey, can I, come by your office and we can go have coffee tomorrow. I think, especially covering the Hill, you really have to be in people's faces. People are not like sitting by their phone waiting for you to call. And if you've tried to get members on the phone, that's always really hard too. So it's just really about like stalking people. Finding out what committees this legislator's gone, going to the meeting, or, getting there when it's letting out. And so it's a big investment in time, but I think it pays off, because I think that's where all the stories are the staffers. And like you said, the best stories are kind of getting past that gatekeeper into the, the chief of staff or the policy people, which are hard.
One more question.
Yeah.
Because of the way we live today, any campaign trail gaffe is instant news. Everybody knows it. Do you have any rules of thumb for how you cover those things or don't cover them?
I just think it's news judgment. This is not exactly an example from the campaign, but I think it was Emily's List put out a press release with a typo where instead of saying that someone was the best, they said they were the worst, or it was something really silly. And we actually posted a story about it, and I thought I just thought that was really silly. It was totally a typo. Oh, I remember when was it Dan Pfeiffer that tweeted something? He meant to say, what was it? Again, it was like a typo situation. And because it was someone who worked in the White House, it got kind of blown up. I just think we have to use our news judgment. That's one of the good things about Twitter, is that like, if something is like just a tiny, tiny bit newsworthy, sometimes that's all it is worth, is one little tweet. And that's about it. So I just think, we just have to be smart. But I also know that like we're all under pressure to write clicky stories. And I was at an event that the Center for American Progress, this liberal think tank, put on, and John Kerry made some offhand remark that was kind of funny about how when he was overseas during the shutdown, people kept offering to buy him lunch. So it was cute. Okay, and me and my news judgment, that was worth a tweet. No more. I think a few other people tweeted it. One of my editors saw it and was like, sent me an email that was like, Twitter doesn't pay the rent. Like, let's get a story up. Let's get a story on our website that says that. Yeah. And I was like, so, we all have to kind of balance those competing pressure. That wasn't a gaffe, but it's the same kind of thing. Like, it's something that really isn't that meaningful, but is kind of funny. So, I'd like to think we can always use our news judgment to decide how much space to give it. But the reality is that if something is clicky, there's a lot of pressure on us. I don't know. I think you just try to handle it as professionally as you can.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Last questions? Before
This,
we release
this
Beth?
was fun.
Well, thank you. It was fun for us too.
It's so much more fun than sitting at my desk and agonizing over what I'm gonna write.
Next story.
Yeah.
More fun than being in the bunker.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you
Thank
being
you.
here.
Nice to meet you.